Welcome to the Thinking Theologically podcast, where we teach you how and why you should think theologically. I'm your host once again, as we continue our discussion of all things spiritual realm with our resident spiritual realm expert, Jack Dodgen. Jack, how are you doing?
Good. I wouldn't call myself an expert. I've read experts. Well, and now I'm, and I've taught it. So there we go. I guess is that all it takes?
I guess so. You're much more of an expert than I am on.
Is expert above master or lower?
Ooh, I don't know. I want to say lower.
We'll let the people decide.
Y'all can comment and let us know.
Yes.
So
but doing well. Excited to talk about the subject and continue where we're going. And we've only got, I think, just a few more left.
Yes, we're getting close to finishing up the Old Testament related things. Mm-hmm. Then we'll move into the New Testament, and as Jack said, it doesn't appear like the New Testament will take us quite as long to work our way through, because there are a lot of themes in the Old Testament that get repeated in the New Testament or expanded a little bit in the New Testament. Some of that we've already hinted at in this episode. By the way, go and I'll mention this again at the end. Go and check out our website for additional content there. There's a lot of cool things that we're doing or getting ready to do, or including these videos that we're still. This is our second time to try this. So if you're seeing the video, it worked at some point. Yeah,
technically our third time to try this, because the second time had some trouble.
But that's in the realm of some new things that we're entering into, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to expand some of the new and unique things. With that being said, I'll go ahead and get us into this next discussion of the unseen realm, talking about God among the gods, among other gods, other spiritual beings, whatever you might want to call them. We'll dive in a little bit more about what you might want to call them. So where we've been, last week we looked at the Tower of Babel and God dispersing not only the nations, but his gods, his agents, his angels, to oversee them, to lead them in the ways of justice and righteousness. In other words, just the ways of God. From Psalm 82, we talked about, we know that this doesn't occur, at least not as God desired, which same thing with us as human beings, and we're going to see some connection to us as human beings as well. In this episode, we're going to see how God interacts with the other gods, the other Elohim. That Hebrew word Elohim is technically plural, so we're talking about gods, plural, but it can be used as what is sometimes referred to, and we've talked about this, as a divine singular. So it can refer to one God, but using the plural to refer to a singular entity kind of heightens the sovereignty, the majesty, the power of that entity. So when just God is used with this plural, that's kind of what's going on. We're heightening the sovereignty of God there. And so we're going to talk about how God interacts with these other gods, these other Elohim, throughout the Bible, in both bad ways as well as in good ways. And the place we're going to start is the gods in Egypt, thinking about the Exodus, which is important. We're going to talk about this a little bit in this episode, especially when we get into the New Testament, because the Exodus is the central image and event that defines who Israel is in the Old Testament, and it's used heavily in the New Testament to then define who Jesus is, because Jesus comes as kind of the embodiment of Israel. Paul, in particular, loves the Exodus motif. Matthew, that's probably his central image. If not secondary to Jesus being Moses, which Jesus being Moses means that he's leading a new Exodus. So they're 1A and 1B, depending on which one you think is more important to Matthew. But that is not only central for Israel and Jesus, but it is also central for our understanding of spiritual realm, which is then important for who Israel is and what we see Jesus doing, as we'll see when we get into the New Testament. So, Jack, why don't you start and talk to us about the gods in Egypt?
Yeah, so aside from it being central, it's obviously not the first occurrence of God interacting with the gods. That is the phrasing I'm going to use, but it's that's Psalm 82:1 language. So if you're concerned, we handled that in our first episode, I believe. We had that discussion, maybe the second one. Just don't be concerned with that word and all of that sort of stuff. We'll kind of lay that out as we go through. But the Exodus is going to be the one most people are familiar with. Like I remember VBS's talking about the plagues make for great fun discussion when you're not on the receiving end of them. When you get to just talk about it as a thing that happened, it's pretty great. And so there's a little bit more layer to it than God wanting to get these people out, and so he's dealing with this guy that's here. There's some other stuff that's going on, because we've said this over and over again in lessons outside of this one, that the spiritual realm is the stuff behind the thing that is seen. So when we talk about Pharaoh being a unjust and unrighteous ruler, why? The case that we're making is that there's something behind all of that leading people into those things. And that's what our real enemy is. And that is the argument Paul is going to make when we get into Ephesians, which we will in, I think, like 3 episodes. Yeah. But we're in Egypt now. Go ahead.
Surprise, surprise. As you said, there's a lot of stories like this that we heard growing up, Bible class, Sunday school, all of that, that not only is there some deeper things going on, but I don't know, it always surprises me, some of the stories that we choose to teach our children. And
Judges, Samson.
It's kind of interesting. The Exodus probably isn't the most interesting, but it's definitely an interesting one when you think about what's actually going on here. I joke, don't take offense at this, but I always joke about, if they made the Old Testament some of these Old Testament stories into movies that are not like Veggie Tales, we probably wouldn't take our kids to see them.
It's true.
So if it was, more real life situation, but we love them in our Bible classes. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but it's just, it's interesting. And for me, what that just means is when we become adults, we need to go back to these stories, because we probably don't fully understand them, because we can't dive into all that with children. Sometimes because they can't understand it, other times because it might not even be appropriate for a particular age group. So, keep that in mind,
we sanitize and cut out some of the depth as well, because some of that is, again, because for our audience, as kids, not necessarily appropriate to hit all of those details, but we get to do that here. So throughout the Exodus, there are supernatural events everywhere. The plagues are not natural. Those are supernatural things. Like, that's how they're expressed to us, as, oh wow, okay, water to blood, that's wild. All of these locusts and frogs and just coming from, where it's meant to be seen in that sort of light. And like Spencer said, growing up with it and hearing it all the time, we kind of just go, yeah, that's the thing that happened, and just keep moving on. But it's very much a supernatural event. When we leave Egypt, the River Jordan will be parted on both sides, allowing for Israel's safe passage on the dry land. During our stay in Egypt, plagues will be delivered by God to Pharaoh and the people of Egypt. Before all of this begins, we're already given a discussion and action between God and the gods. So before the plagues happen, you have Exodus 5, 1 through 3. Moses and Aaron go before Pharaoh and ask to hold a festival for God to get the people out. This is, hey, tell Pharaoh this, and that's how we're going to get out of here, basically. Pharaoh says no. Moses does a lot of things wrong here. This is not a Moses lesson. He is not told to take Aaron. He's told to take the elders of Israel. He does not do that. He takes Aaron and doesn't bring the elders. So he does not listen to God fully in how he goes about this. That's why it fails. But when Pharaoh says no, then Moses responds in a different way, talking about his God, but in a way that Pharaoh would understand. So Pharaoh's response to the first thing that Moses says is, I do not know who Yahweh is, and I do not care. That's not a God that he believes in. That's not one that he worships, so it does not matter to him that their God wants them to go do that. It doesn't matter. His gods are the ones that matter. So Moses responds by saying, we have to go or we will be punished by our God, which isn't accurate, but is how Pharaoh would relate to his gods. So I think there's an appeal from Moses here that let me talk in your language, how you understand these things to work. We actually, in Genesis 12, when we're first introduced to Abram, the covenant, go with me, walk before me, all of this stuff, they end up in Egypt. And it is the say that you're my sister so that I don't die situation. They do that. It's a mistake. And the Pharaoh there in Egypt knows that something is wrong because plagues start happening. Because that's how he relates to his gods. That's how they work. Bad things start happening. Something must be wrong. The gods are ticked off. And that's really the glimpse we get there. We get more of it here, and we see as God walks us through the bringing of these plagues. So Egypt was a polytheistic society, meaning they had beliefs in gods pretty well over everything. Cows, horses, fertility, fire, ice, buildings, etc. Everything had a god over it. A lot of times you would have kind of sub-gods and then the gods over them, and there was a lot of fighting between those things, and they really didn't care about people. That's kind of the overall theme. We need to understand that polytheism brings with it indirect relationship with people. As opposed to Yahweh, who creates man in his image, the gods of these other belief systems would interact with people, but it was for them, not for you. It was all about their glory in this. So if the rain suddenly stops, the rain and the sun gods must be feuding with each other. They're fighting each other. They don't care how it affects you. They're doing their stuff up there, in the spiritual realm. Maybe you could sacrifice enough and cry out loud enough to stop the fighting, but you'll probably just have to wait out the battle, and because the gods don't care about you. I mean, that's what that is. A lot of worship for the ancient world, and this will carry into Greece and Rome and all this. A lot of worship in the ancient world is, maybe this will make the gods not take out their anger on me. And then sometimes you had, maybe we'll get a blessing from this. But it was really just, when Zeus wakes up on the wrong side of the bed, I hope he doesn't destroy my family. So I'm going to go sacrifice. But it wasn't a relationship, at least not a positive relationship. It was very much an abusive relationship, and those are the gods they worshipped. One scholar put it this way, and this is a loose quote, but the gods of the ancient world were basically humans with superpowers. So they had all the human emotions of, I'm mad today, I'm upset today, I'm just feeling rather emotional today, I'm going to take it out on you because I can. Moses' language here then about God punishing, Yahweh will be angry with us, reflects the relationship other societies have with their gods, specifically Egypt here. If we don't worship, our God will be angry with us and smite us. Even still, Pharaoh cares nothing for Yahweh. He's not an Egyptian God, so he doesn't care about him. And inflicts further punishment on Israel. That's the, you'll have to get your own straw now for the bricks and all this. And so Yahweh from here is going to prove to Pharaoh that he is, in fact, God of Egypt too. He's not just God of these people out here in the land of Goshen. He's his God. It all belongs to him. We'll talk more about that kind of idea here in just a little bit. But so as a result of this indirect connection to the gods, Pharaoh may have been more interested in Yahweh's power and precision in what he's going to do. We'll see in the plagues that Pharaoh is used to powerful things happening, but there are some things that Yahweh is going to do that he's very much not used to. When we go into the plagues, we get, and I think Spencer will have some stuff to say about this too, we have magicians in Pharaoh's court, and when we read these kinds of texts, there's this temptation to go, they pretended to do these things, they appeared to do certain kinds of things, but they're not actually doing that. I think it's important, two things. One, the way the narrative presents it is not they appeared or pretended to do these things. The way it's presented to us is they did this. But the second very important part is, but God does it better. Moses and Aaron do it better with God's power. If they're only appearing and pretending to do these things, it really feels like it robs the point of Yahweh is greater than these things. No, they have some power, but Yahweh has all of it. Any thoughts on that? We're kind of weirdly on the script here, but go ahead.
I would recommend. I think I've said this before. I know I've recommended it to Jack. It's been a while since I've listened to it. The After Class podcast. It's three professors. I can't remember what university they're at, but they're Christian church disciples somewhere. Something. So they come from their restoration movement. So they think very similarly to the way that we do. Like there's things that they say, they're like, that's you might as well be Church of Christ. Like that's the way they talk about a lot of things. With that being said, there's one of them's an Old Testament guy, one of them's a New Testament guy, one of them's a theology guy. So you get the three primary disciplines all discussing these topics. They did a series, it's been a while now, but they did a series on the spiritual realm. And one of their key passages in talking about this was that scene when Saul wants to bring back Samuel and goes and finds this witch woman to raise him from the dead, and Samuel comes back and he's like, well, why have you woken me? And it's a very very one of those very weird stories in the Old Testament. But it's proof that magic, or whatever you want to call it, existed. Like if you want to take that story seriously, and I think it's very hard not to, unless you want to go in the direction of allegory or metaphor, which I'm not. If you've listened to enough of our episodes or anything that I've written, you know that I'm not necessarily opposed to that. The whole Jewish and Christian tradition is about reading things allegorically. Like it's one of the ways you're able to apply a story of the past to the present, is you have to pull some of those things. So you can either go that direction, which I'm assuming a lot of our listeners are hesitant to do, which you probably should be hesitant to go that direction. Not that you never should go that direction. And that's one of the texts that I'm more willing to go more in a literal direction. And so that's a prime example of there's not much you can do with that without believing that these things are possible. And Saul does it without going to God. He goes to witch, in essence, is what he does. That's what I think that's pretty much what she's called in the text, if I remember correctly. And so if that's the case, then I think we also have to accept that these magicians, these witches, warlocks, whatever we want to call them, in Egypt are able to do certain things. But as Jack said, they're not able to go as far as what God is able to do, because the whole point is God is greater than their. If you think of the ancient world, it's a battle of magic. God has magic. These magicians have magic. God is greater. He's able, and we might not like that term magic, and I get that because it makes us think of a Halloween movie, and fair. But that's in the ancient world. That's probably the way the people would have been thinking about it. It's a battle of the gods. It's a battle of the magic and the powers that we have, that we derive from the gods, and that actually, I think that becomes the foundation for a lot of the supernatural stuff that we have today. Because I just think of movies, and a lot of the times witches and stuff, that they're pulling their magic from places, like from nature, or from souls of the past or something like that. That's in essence what's going on here. They're pulling these abilities from the gods. And God is like, I can outdo far beyond anything that you or your gods or your magicians are able to do, which, as Jack said, is the point of the story. And
yeah, and I'll say to empty these non-good individuals of their power is really lowering God's power too. Like, the point of these narratives is they have some ability, but they cannot match. And this gets extended even further, because before the plagues happen, we have they throw their staffs down, turns into serpents. There's multiple of these individuals going up against, Moses and Aaron and God. There are multiple gods, here in the Egyptian pantheon going up against Yahweh and all of this. But the one staff swallows up theirs. Like, the whole idea is, it doesn't matter how many of them there are, God can't be beaten. And if you're with God, you're gonna win. We see the same kind of thing. I don't think this will be the last time I reference this. We see it with Elijah, where he goes, it's just me at the altar here, and you have all the prophets of, I'll say Baal, but Spencer and I had a conversation about that. Prophets of Baal standing there, and the majority doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Whatever power he may have or claim to have, whatever, it doesn't compare to Yahweh and those that are on his side. And so we get that at the beginning part of the Exodus here, and then it will be shown through these plagues. So when you go read through the plagues, which we won't cover all of them here for sake of time, I think it is reasonable to look at them as God is hitting Pharaoh and his belief system and these gods that he believes in right in their areas of jurisdiction. I mean, they would think, we have a God for this, we have a God for this, we have a God. So we have Yahweh each time going, I'm greater than him, I'm greater than her, I'm greater than this one, I'm greater than that thing over here. And that's the point. And that also just shows Pharaoh's stubbornness is far more than two guys coming before him saying, hey, we want your labor force to go. It's, no, we're also saying our God is so much better than yours. I mean, this is not just a physical encounter. This is a whole religious belief system for Pharaoh. He would have been a descendant of the gods. He's reigning after all. I mean, this is striking right at the core of everything that he is and believes. And so there's more depth to all the plague stuff here than we get, when we're reading it as kids and all of that. Okay, so a couple things I want to highlight. Because I believe it's possible these plagues are taking direct shots at the gods of Egypt, in the same way that, like, Baal is supposedly the god who deals with rain and other things like that. Well, during Elijah's time, all the prophets of Baal are wanting rain to come, but it's a drought. And it's not until Elijah prays to Yahweh that Yahweh says, now I'll bring rain. That's very much I don't think there's a lot of arguing about that one, that's a direct response to Israel and their belief in Baal. That seems to be happening here too. And two that I want to highlight, the plague of frogs, and I heard a sermon on this that I thought was really good years ago. When Pharaoh is asked, when do you want this to go away? He says tomorrow. He doesn't say, well, let's do it right now so I can sleep better, get these things out of here. Tomorrow. And there seems to be this, I mentioned it earlier, the Pharaoh's used to power in some sense, but something about precision, the gods listening to you and doing it when you want the thing to happen would be weird. because gods do what they want to do. So asking for, let's do tomorrow. And if, he listens, and Moses, I think, gets this, because Moses responds with, and this is Exodus 8, verse 10, according to your word, in order that you may acknowledge that there's no one like Yahweh our God. So there's something about this precision of our God is different. He's more powerful, but he also listens. He cares for us. That's why he's trying to get us out of here. It'll happen tomorrow so that you can acknowledge who he is. So there's an interesting encounter there. But then also the seventh plague, the one of hail, speaks of fire as well. In fact, the Hebrew can be translated. I'm not arguing that it should, but the phrasing of Hebrew can be like fire encased in hail, which is, well, we hear that and we go, that's not possible. Go ahead.
I'm assuming that's where we get the term hailfire.
Oh, maybe, yeah.
I wonder if any.
Yeah, I think so.
I wonder if any translations, older translations.
It's almost like ice napalm. It's like ice napalm. Like the ice hits the ground, smashes something, and then pops open, and here comes fire or something. So, I don't know. Let me know if you find out some linguistic stuff for us there. But the spiritual importance of this is, in a polytheistic worldview, those gods don't work together. It's not impossible, but these opposing elements would also be opposing gods. And so one would fight for its fire dominion and one would fight for, dominion of ice instead. So to see these two opposing elements come together and come down in opposition against Egypt would not only be Yahweh is more powerful than your God of fire and your God of ice. It's Yahweh can do whatever he wants with whatever he wants because it's all under his control. And so seeing these opposing elements together would hit him in the core. Go ahead.
So logos defines the term, the Hebrew term there. It says, I've never seen this before. It says hailstones, and then parentheses, it says thunderbolts with a question mark. I've never seen
Wow.
the software define a term with a maybe it's like maybe it's this. So that is I looked at the original King James and I was just curious if it got translated as something like hailfire or something like that in some older translations, and it might have an A translation, but I didn't find it. But I thought that definition was interesting and that would, something like that would connect with the idea of hail and fire. A hailstorm, lightning, and I'm no Hebrew guy, but I thought that was an interesting way that Logos decided to define it.
But these the opposing elements and then the emphasis on precision when it comes to the frogs, like all of these are pointing at things that, while we'll say the level of power that Yahweh is using, Pharaoh would not be used to that, but he is used to some amount of power, whether that's always from the gods or interpreted as such. He's used to powerful things occurring. That's not the surprise. The surprise is the precision of God he's listening and willing to do it on my timetable. That's interesting. He's able to combine these elements. And I want to say too, this is me working on the fly. I said that this was the seventh plague. I'm wanting to, it is after this plague, these opposing elements working together. Pharaoh sent and called Moses and Aaron and said to them, "This time I have sinned." This is the first time in the narrative where Pharaoh says, maybe I've done some morally wrong thing here. There's something about seeing this kind of power that Pharaoh finally though it doesn't stick around, obviously, but Pharaoh has this moral admission of guilt, which is a really interesting kind of turn in the narrative. Several plagues before this, the magicians in his court go, "We can't replicate this. We don't have this kind of power. This is the finger of God." So they see it before Pharaoh does, but after Pharaoh gets precision and Pharaoh gets these opposing elements working together, it hits him differently, and he goes, "Man, I'm a sinner. I've done some things wrong here," and it doesn't stick. We can talk about why maybe another episode, because I know that's a question for a lot of people about all of this and hardening of heart and all that stuff. But these two events hit Pharaoh in a very unique kind of way, and it's because of his belief in his gods and how Yahweh is working and very much subverting his expectations about how the gods work. We see this too as a parallel in Daniel, where the king is surrounded by his court and the interpreters and the wise men, the astrologers, and all of this, and they're highlighted a number of times through the text. But they can't, tell what the dream is. They can't interpret the dream, but Daniel can with Yahweh. And that's that same theme of the majority doesn't matter. They have more gods, doesn't matter. Yahweh and the people on his side are going to be victorious. And that is the theme over and over again of they might have some power, but God has it all. We see that with Elijah, in Daniel, and here in the Exodus. So summarize all of this before the next point. The plagues show God's strength in nations that supposedly do not belong to him, right? Egypt is not his turf, but it is his turf. God is God of all the nations and is capable of exercising power over them without fight from the divine beings that are opposed to him. Any thoughts about Egypt or any of that before we jump into the next spot?
Yeah, real quick, I guess since Jack's leading our conversation on spiritual realm things, I'm the application guy. Jack and I talked about this a little bit before. There was an application that came to my mind because it actually fits with an application that I'm making in my sermon on Sunday in our series through the book of Judges. And this God among the gods and showing himself to be greater than, and that's a theme that continues throughout the Old Testament and even into the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, as I said earlier, the Exodus is central because it's how Israel identifies who they are. They are the people that Yahweh God led out of slavery in Egypt. Not that any other God did, but Yahweh did these amazing things and led them out of Egypt and made Israel his people. Therefore, Israel is to do all of these other things. So like anytime they're sinning and God's like, don't do that, the prophet begins with the God who led you out of Egypt. This is the God. Like remember the Exodus. And part of that is remembering that this God chose you, but when he led them out of Egypt and they're at Mount Sinai, God reminds them that he's the God of the entire earth is mine. So it's also a reminder that he is the God of everywhere. He is the God that is greater than these other gods, as Jack shows. We've seen that in the plagues. And so you treat and interact with God differently. There's expectations that come with that. And to me, one of the things for the church today that illustrates is there's this balance between the holiness of God on one hand. So I think of Leviticus 19, be holy as I am holy. God is set apart. He is different than everything, but in the Old Testament, the more important thing is he's different than the other gods. And Jack just illustrated how the plagues illustrate that. God's holiness is his difference than these other spiritual beings. And we're going to continue to show how that's the case. And so you treat God as different. Israel is not to interact with God like they do with the other gods. And there's some application to that today in that we interact with God differently, or we should, than we interact with others. So when we come to God in prayer, or when we gather around the table, or when we come in worship, we enter into the presence of God, realizing that it is the sovereign, holy God. Like there's something different that's happening here than what happens in the other spaces and places that we fill throughout our daily lives. Now, that though I think is balanced with what I would say is the love of God, because God is different, but he doesn't necessarily want to be treated different. And what I mean by that is I think of passages where the Hebrew author makes the statement that we can confidently, through the blood of Jesus, enter into the most holy places. So like Israel treated God as holy if only the priest, only on the Day of Atonement, entered into the presence of God. And the Hebrew author is like, well, because of Jesus, we can not only regularly do that, but we can do it with confidence. Like we don't have to come. Is it different? Yes. But do we do it in fear? No. He says we now do it in confidence. And when I think about, Jesus' comments of if God takes care of the birds, how much more will he take care of you? And the model prayer, when we come to God, we recognize the holiness of God, hallowed be your name, but then forgive us our debts, give us this day our daily bread. We see of God's care and compassion for everyday life. So God, that's the image I think of God as Father, of come to me with all of these things. Yes, I'm holy. Yes, I'm sovereign. But because of that, I want you to bring these things to me because I care. And I think there's that balance there because, in the way that I grew up, I think in the church, we tended to focus too much on the holiness and sovereignty of God. And so it was like, well, when you come here, it's different. Therefore, we cared so much about the way that you dress when you show up to worship, which I think is completely missing the point of worship, in my opinion. It's like I'm not sure that matters a whole lot. But the point is this is different, so you should dress differently. And it's like I get where you're coming from. I agree with the premise. I don't necessarily agree with how we're applying that.
Sure.
But it is different, and so you don't just casually come to it. That doesn't mean you can't dress casually. Like I think that that's a whole different conversation. But we tended to focus on that, and I think that misses the point of worshiping God. I also heard things like, especially for the Lord's Supper, like completely clear your mind of all your worldly thoughts. And I think God would say, no, you bring those to me, and you allow me to work within the things that are going on in your life because I actually care about them. And the pushback that I get sometimes with that is, well, yeah, but I can't be sitting in worship thinking about where I'm going to lunch. And I'm like, okay, true. But I would argue, I think the point of worship is laying all those things at the feet of the cross. And I think when my mind is thinking about lunch, this might sound weird, but if I lay my lunch at the feet of the cross, I think there's some conviction there about where my priorities are. Like, why am I focused on this and not on that? And I'm actually allowing Jesus to work within that. So I would say, don't even clear your mind of where you're going to lunch, but put that at the cross, and maybe there's something that Jesus has to say to you about your priorities. I think the problem is when we're not engaged in worship and laying those things at the feet of the cross. Now, we might do a whole episode on worship later, but
sure,
there's this balance there that when we realize what Jack is saying, that God is different, yes, let's emphasize that. But I would just, in thinking of application, let's balance that with he's also God that is Father, God that is love and mercy and grace, as well as a God that is holy and sovereign and just and righteous. We can't lean too far one way at the expense of the other. And I just want to say that because I think particularly in our tradition, in churches of Christ, we tended to put little too much weight on the holiness and sovereignty and forget about the love, grace, mercy part.
To that point.
Particularly when we're coming into the presence of God.
To that point. Sorry, I think there was a bit of a hiccup in the video there. So if I ran over you, that's what happened for me. To that point, Exodus 34, 6 and 7, when Moses asks to see the name of God, which is also the glory of God and his goodness. Like those three words are intertwined. You do get the holiness and justice aspect of visiting the iniquity of the fathers to the third and the fourth. But it talks about his love to the thousandth. And so there is that overriding. So when we talk about God being different, it's not Well, it's not that he doesn't punish like these other gods do, but a lot of the largest part of his difference is that he is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. And you get that there in Exodus 34, 6 and 7 with the name, and it's just all over the place. In fact, that's, I believe, the most internally quoted section of Scripture, either directly or alluded to, throughout the Old Testament. The prophets and Nehemiah and all these will say that same phrase of steadfast, gracious, merciful, because this God is different in those ways. And alongside what you said, Hebrews 4, entering the throne room of God with confidence because of Jesus' sacrifice, is not, I need to cast all my anxieties out. No, you need to bring those and lay them down. Come on in. Confidently and take those and say, God, here's what I got. Help me with this stuff. So very good application. Before we do the next point too, I want to add this. We need to understand this will still be true in the New Testament and still true today. These other things, the rebellious things, do have power. Those things do want you to go with them and to follow them and all of this, but Yahweh has all of it. Stay with him, even if the majority is with this side of things, even if that power seems appealing and strong, it pales in comparison. Just every single time that we're shown it. So just another thought there of, if you think this way of doing things would be better, it might seem that way. It might even work that way for a time, but it's not. Don't go that route. So okay.
All right.
Next, if you're ready for me.
Yeah. So we talked about the Exodus now and the significance of the Exodus. There's another important part within Israel's history, and we talked about this with the theme of land last week as well. Yes. So there's a lot of what we're talking about is there are these bigger themes that not only identify who Israel is, but therefore identify, when we get to the New Testament, who Jesus is, who's meant to be the embodiment of Israel. That is Canaan, the promised land, and the gods that exist within the land of Canaan. So, Jack, let's talk about gods in Canaan.
So this is where we start to get into like the obscure passages that if you've read them. Now, this first one is a little bit different, but the next few sections we'll look at after that are those, like, if you do daily Bible reading through the whole Bible, you've read these passages, but you probably didn't read these passages, because there's some of that obscure stuff that people are like, I didn't know that was in there. And that's what a lot of these things are. Even this first example, we'll be talking about Naaman, and he's someone we're familiar with because there are some baptism connections and kind of thoughts with this, and that's typically how we talk about this. Go and wash yourself and all this sort of stuff. Like we have some connectivity to it, but there's a very weird verse within that. I want to talk. Go ahead,
real quick.
Mention
this, and then we'll move on. Allegory, by the way, Naaman and baptism.
Yes,
I just like to point out that we do it with this story. So,
by the way, that's also just a word that Paul uses in Galatians. Talking about the two mountains, he just uses the word allegory. So there, it's okay. I want to make this point foundationally, talking about land and all of this. So the ancient cultures, the gods that you believed in were not only over certain things, they were over certain areas. So I think the best way to think about this is like the Philistines, their god was over the sea. So they're going to want to fight you at sea because that's where God is. That's where their God is. So they have home field advantage. It's very much kind of that sort of thing. Localized gods is how that's typically the scholarship phrase of just gods within certain area. My God is the God of the mountains, so I want to fight you in the mountains. I don't want to fight you in the valley because That's my God doesn't have jurisdiction there. He only has it here, or within this plot of land, or whatever it may be. Israel thought this way too. And there are several examples of this, but Israel also thought of Yahweh in terms of, oh, the promised land is where he's at. Specifically, the temple is his place. Like, that's where he has jurisdiction. The tabernacle was that, and so wherever the tabernacle went with them, that's where his power was. They struggled for a while, it appears at least, to think of our God is God over everything, and God wants everything, and it's all his. And they can believe that he's creator of the world, but they still struggled with the localization stuff like the other nations did. So we get an example of some of this localization, not within Israel, but not with Israel. But then we'll come to that in a little bit. So 1 Kings 5, 15 through 19. Talking about Naaman and his healing of leprosy. After his healing by dipping in the Jordan River 7 times, we get this interaction between Naaman and Elisha. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him, and he said, Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth, but in Israel, so accept now a present from your servant. But he said, As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Then Naaman said, this is the weird passage, If not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth, for from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord. In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. He said to him, Go in peace. That last verse is also really just a fun, strange thing. He has to go into this temple to worship this false god because his master goes in there and he needs his help in order to worship. But Naaman is saying, I'm not worshiping that guy anymore. The Lord of Israel is the only one. Yahweh is the only God. I'm not offering sacrifice to anybody but him now. That's all great. We love that. Like, that's what you want to see happen. But surrounding all of the burnt offering and sacrifice conversation, he says, I'm going to need 2 mule loads of earth from here to go with me back home. Okay, what does any of that have to do with sacrifice? The best illustration I have for this, I think this happened a couple years ago. The college football juggernaut that is Alabama versus Tennessee, who notoriously has just been the whipping post of the SEC. They beat Alabama. And the next day, there was a lady who had gone out onto the field and taken some of the top layer of the sod from the football field and was selling it on eBay. Like, this is the hallowed ground where Tennessee took down the Alabama Crimson Tide and started selling those things. This is similar to that. Like, well, this is now sacred land because of the thing that happened here. That's what she's going for. And I've seen that done with other things. This building's getting taken down, so if you want a commemorative, brick from the building and all that stuff, and I'm not knocking that. I am knocking the Tennessee-Alabama thing. It's just wild. Football does that to people.
They, and you mentioned in sports that happens a lot. So, you replace a basketball court, they'll sell pieces of the court.
Yeah.
They've even done the same thing with like NASCAR tracks and some of that. When you break it up, you can now part of that is it helps pay for putting the new one in there.
Yeah.
But it's also like I'm a Lakers fan and they replaced the court and it's like, well, Kobe Bryant played on this court. Like there's something cool, unique, special.
Yes.
Of owning a piece of that. So that's the point that you're
or even like
making
I think the flu game shoes for Michael sold for several million the other day. Because there is this amazing thing happened on this thing or in these things, whatever. And so there's this greater value ascribed to it. That's what's happening here.
from baseball
Yes.
stadiums.
Yeah.
So
that's what's going on here. What Naaman knows, because he's coming from a localized God belief system. And again, Israel also has this thing. Like, that's just normal belief system. He comes in, is healed from this thing in this amazing way. That's all he knows. It happened here. And so when I go back home, I want to have land from here, like 2 mule loads worth of earth. And it's connected to his offering of burnt offerings and sacrifices to Yahweh, which is the name that's used here in the text. So the idea here is that he's going to lay that ground down, and that's what he's going to worship on, because this is land that belongs to Yahweh, and he wants to take it back home with him. Okay, so we might look at this and go, dude, it all belongs to Yahweh. What are you doing? But that was just not how they thought. That's just not how the thought process was. And so he wants to take some of this home. But it's a for us, a very obscure passage of, I don't get that. Well, yeah, because we don't think in those terms. We think of our God is God over. That's a good thing to think about. How we might apply that and live those things out probably needs some work. But we don't have a problem with that kind of worldview. They didn't think that way. And so that's why he's taking the land back there. We get a little bit more of this. Our second passage here is 1 Samuel 5. During the time of Samuel's judging, the Ark of the Covenant is brought out to war and taken out in the front of the battle lines against the Philistines, because, well, if we bring the Ark out, that means our God is with us. Well, Yahweh was with them anyway. We know that. We read the text and we go, God's with them as they go do this. But their thought is, we need the Ark with us to bring God into battle to have success. So they get absolutely obliterated. The Ark of the Covenant gets stolen by the Philistines. And then we get this account in 1 Samuel 5. When the Philistines captured the Ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the Ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. That's the half fish, half man god, because the Philistines are seafaring people. When the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, so worshiping Yahweh. They took Dagon and put him back in his place. When they rose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. This is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. And so we get that may be a section that you've heard of before. I had certainly heard of it before, but there's a thing happening here, because after this, the ark is going to get passed around, and plagues and other things are going to happen to the Philistines, and the Philistines are going to go, we don't want this anymore. Get this out of here. Again, that's how their gods would have interacted with them. So they get the picture. What's changed? Oh, we brought this here and things started going bad. This is the problem. The gods are upset about it. Send it out of here. But this final verse in 1 Samuel 5, verse 5, of when the priests would go back into the temple, they didn't stop worshiping this god. They didn't stop serving this god Dagon. But there was part of the temple now that they said, we can't walk here, because Dagon does not have jurisdiction right here now. He kept falling before the ark in this spot. We can't walk here because our God is not in control of this space. And it's just another example of that localization of gods, and they only have power and authority over certain places. And this is very much a blink and you'll miss it sort of text, but it's God showing his power among people that are not his, because he has power over everything. And it's another text that points to not only their thought process, but how God shows that power. So the summary here is the God of Israel is not bound like the other gods. He isn't stuck in one place with one area of jurisdiction, though he takes Israel specifically as his people for the purpose of blessing all the nations, redeeming all of the creation back to himself. He is God over all the nations. That is the point that we see here in these places. There are other things we're not covering, the chariots of fire stuff, and you brought up Witch of Endor and all of that, and we I don't really have anything specifically to cover there, but there are those kinds of events, and they highlight God can do what he wants where he wants. The opening of Ezekiel is like that too. Yahweh is not at the temple, he's in Babylon, and Ezekiel is shocked by this, but Yahweh is over it all. He can do whatever he wants. So there's plenty of places like that. Canaan is just another one of those places, like Egypt and others, where he shows that. So any thoughts on that before we move into a more kind of positive God interaction?
No, I don't have anything to add there. So we can now move into the final section that you have here, talking about God's divine counsels. Like you said, going a little bit from the negative side of things of God among the what we might want to call evil gods of other nations, though there might be some problems at times with some of that language. But now we move in definitely into a more positive direction of God among his divine counsel, which we've referenced at this point. But Jack, why don't you talk about how that fits into this picture that we've been creating here?
So I had a couple sections here. I will truncate one of them and encourage the audience to just go read it, because I'm running longer than I thought I would with this episode, as it always seems to go with anything that I talk about. There's one section of scripture in particular that's just very unique and gives us a bit of a glimpse of like things going on. So far we've seen God at work either in the nations of those that worship other gods or against the gods themselves, the rebellious beings that he put over these nations. Again, is the case that we've made. Deuteronomy 32, 7 and 8, Psalm 82. God puts those things there at the dispersal of Tower of Babel to focus in on Israel, to bring everyone back, with the expectation that they would lead in justice and righteousness, and they do not. So there's this mistaken kind of idea that God abandons all the other nations within the Old Testament, and that's really not it. There are all sorts of things going on behind the scenes. Israel's just our focus as we go through the text. That's going to get us to Jesus. But God's working in these other places too, and we get sometimes some pictures of those things. So we'll make a mention of a thing in Daniel in just a little bit, but I want to read this text specifically. Prophet Micaiah, this whole interaction is just great. Dealing with King Ahab and how God is going to bring about Ahab's demise here. This is what the prophet Micaiah says. So this is 1 Kings 22, starting in verse 13. The messenger who went to summon Micaiah said to him, "Behold, the words of the prophets with one accord are favorable to the king. Let your word be like the word of one of them, and speak favorably." But Micaiah said, "As the Lord lives, what the Lord says to me, that I will speak." And when he had come to the king said to him, "Micaiah, shall we go up to Ramoth Gilead to battle, or shall we refrain?" And he answered him, "Go up in triumph, the Lord will give it into the hand of the king." But the king said to him, "How many times shall I make you swear that you speak to me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" I love prophets with a little bit of sass and sarcasm. I think that means that preachers can get away with that too. Verse 17. He said, "I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains as sheep that have no shepherd. And the Lord said, these have no master, let each return to his home in peace." And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "Did I not tell you that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil?" And Micaiah said, "Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then the Spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said, By what means? And he said, I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now, therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all of these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you. So we get this image of like, hey, let me show you what I was shown. Let me tell you what I was shown here. God sitting on his throne. On his right hand and on his left are his divine counsel, like beings that are there with him. And they're not just there with him, they're having a conversation. And what the text tells us is the Lord says, how are we going to do this thing that will entice Ahab to go up and lose in this battle here? And it says, one spirit comes up and says, here's my idea. And another one comes up and says, but I think that this might be the best way to go about it. And it's this third spirit that comes forward and says, I'll entice him. Well, how are you going to do that? I'll go be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets, and they'll tell him he'll be successful, and he'll go, and he'll lose, and all this. And then Yahweh says, go do that. You are going to be successful. That's going to work, and make it happen. But we get this picture of God isn't just sitting up there going, I know everything. I know how everything's going to work. You just do what you're told. I don't really care about anything yet. I made you, just go do this. There's interaction between God and these created spiritual beings about how to accomplish the will of God, which will spoil it now. That is God's relationship with his church now of, go out and evangelize, go out and reach people, benevolence, and love your neighbor, and all of these things. Well, how do you want us to do those things? There's a million ways to do those things. Go out and pursue those things in the various way where you are in the best ways possible, and all this. I'll leave some more of that application to you here in a little bit, Spencer. But that involvement of God doesn't just want his will to be accomplished. He wants his people, that includes his created spiritual beings, he wants those that are with him not just to be with him to do his bidding, but he wants them to have the same desire that he has, and to have input in those things and go, God, I feel like this is going to be the best process to accomplish this goal. And God knows, it appears, that suggestion's not going to work. That one's not going to, that one right there, that'll do it. That'll work on Ahab. Go do that. But there's input and interaction. God could have just said, I need somebody to go do this. But he wants that input, and it's quite an amazing little section here. Just a few verses that Micaiah throws out at us, and then we move on, because it's not really about this. It's about Ahab and everything that's happening here. But we get this look into, this is how God works up there? Yeah, it's how God works up there. This is his divine counsel and the process about how he goes about doing things. Before I bring up Daniel, is there anything you want to interject into there?
Yeah, there's a couple things that came to my mind. One is this fits in with our discussion of, I've argued in the past for open theism, which can be a little bit controversial, but it's the idea that God doesn't know the future. He knows every possible future. And I think that to me, that's the only satisfactory way in my mind that you deal with the problem of free will. Of if God knows the future, then the future is a concrete thing that is to be known and cannot be changed. And you have the problem with, well, then do I get to really make my own decisions? But if there are multiple possible futures and God knows all of them, and God's going to get God's way regardless of which one of those futures actually happen, which is then based on the way that we choose. And God, because he knows us so well, knows with a pretty good deal of certainty what we're going to choose. I think you actually end up with a more powerful God in that view, because he is able to, within anything that you choose, say, well, I'm still going to get my way. And if you choose this, I'm going to do it that way. If you choose this, I'm going to do it that way. It also explains why sometimes God is surprised in the Bible. Like something happens and it doesn't seem like he expected that to happen. It makes more sense of some of those passages. And I think it makes sense of this one, because you have these people coming up with different options, and it may not be, well, that's not going to work. It's like, well, maybe all of them could work, but what's the best route forward? And why would God even take suggestions? Well, maybe because it's like, well, we could do all these different things and I'm still going to get my way, but there might be one that is better, that I prefer this way. And so he's having this conversation about, well, of these options, maybe what is the best one? The lying spirit's interesting. I'm going to say this, and then we're not really going to have the ability to discuss it. But I did in grad school, I did a assignment for an ethics class, and it was like a series of sermons on different ethical issues, and one of them was on lying. And I went through and I looked at every text, literally every text in the Bible that discusses lying. And what was interesting to me is we tend to define it as not telling the truth, but there's not a single text that I found that in the Bible that defines it that way. Lying is not telling the truth it's always for dishonest gain. It's for bringing people away from God. It's for deceiving people to do something that is wrong. It's not ever not telling the truth. And so do with that what you will for texts like these. Because I found that interesting because you have the ethical problem of, well, then is making up a fictitious story for your kids with a good moral point, is that lying? Well, most of us would say no, right? Or what do you do if you were living in Germany during the Holocaust and you were hiding a Jew and a Nazi soldier comes to your door what do you do? Like most of us would say, well, you tell them nobody's there. Like you save the person's life. Well, how do we make those ethical decisions? It's interesting if the Bible doesn't tend to define lying like we tend to think that it is. So that might help with because we see God with a lying spirit. That also fits Old Testament, everything good and evil comes from God, but there might also be something going on in the way we define this term. Maybe I'm wrong, but I did go and read all of them, and I thought it was interesting. There was always a bigger moral concern of deceit, of envy, of personal gain, of leading people away. It was never just not telling the truth. There was always it's bringing something about. So that's something interesting to mention. But kind of like you said, the application with the church. So if we think of God possible futures, then God's going to get God's way. To me, the question for the church becomes almost like, are we going to make it easy on him? Like God desires to use us in certain ways. Are we going to allow God to use us, or is God going to have to go and do it the hard way? God's going to get what God wants, but he desires to do it through us. And that also, the last thing I'll say real quick with that is that also fits in with the idea of, we're trying to figure out what college you're going to go to or what job you're going to take or something like that. And, you want God's guidance in that. Like, which one does God want? My grandfather used to say this. I think sometimes we're choosing between a bunch of good options, and God's like, well, you just, whatever you want to do. Like, sometimes God is more specific because he wants us to use us for a specific thing, and so he needs us to be in this place. But sometimes God's like, no, I'm going to get my way. I'm going to do what I need to do, regardless of what decision you make. That's also true. But sometimes our decisions are open to us. Like, choose any of those schools, choose any of those jobs. It's going to work out. Which one do you prefer? I think sometimes God, I actually think that's true with most decisions. I think most of the time there is more than one good option that God's okay with. And he's just like, well, you choose.
Yeah.
What do you want to do?
It's open to you. I had a professor say the same kind of thing, but the comment about are we going to make it easy for him or not? It's like, well, God desired to bring Israel into the promised land and then went, well, I guess we're putting a 40-year delay on this because this generation's not ready for it, but I still want to do that. And then they get there and don't clear out all of the bad influences. So we go into Judges of, well, I guess we're going to take longer to deal with this problem. But that was, if you do those things and are desiring the same thing he is, promised land is fulfilled in Joshua, and we could just be done with this whole thing. Yeah. He's accomplished his goal. But people made it more difficult. Okay, so I want to reference Daniel. We won't read it. It's a longer section, Daniel 10 through 21. So I won't read that, but I do want to make a point there about this because it's here that we have God's good spiritual beings working on his behalf against rebellious spiritual beings in the book of Daniel there. So in this section, we get the word prince used multiple times, and it's used to refer to both Michael and Gabriel as princes. They are undeniably, I've never heard people Spencer might have. I have not heard people argue Michael and Gabriel are not spiritual beings. And so we have the title prince assigned to them, but in the same passage, we not only have the same word used, but we also have interaction between. Gabriel and Michael interacting, fighting is the word that's used, against the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece. Or the prince of Greece will be a thing that they fight soon. So what we get there are a couple things. First, if we're going to take one prince as meaning spiritual being, realm, and all that, which again, Michael and Gabriel, that's what that is. Like, people do not argue those not being spiritual beings. But if you're going to accept that as a spiritual being thing, you should apply that consistently across the board, especially in the same text, in a text that describes them interacting with one another. So what that seems to be painting for us is a picture of good spiritual beings on God's behalf fighting against rebellious spiritual beings. And in the greater text of Daniel, where you have nations rising and falling and God being in on all of that sort of thing, you have Babylon, is a problem. So is Persia, so is Greece, and all of this. But there's an unseen problem behind that problem. And God is actively involved in that too. Like, that's all a part of that same process. Daniel's also involved in it through his prayer, through his wisdom, through exercising the righteousness and justice of God where he is. He's also fighting not just against the seen things, Nebuchadnezzar and the king of Babylon, but also actively working against the unseen evil influences as a result of all of that. And for a while, the nation of Babylon is turned more and more towards Yahweh and his principles, and then it all comes crashing down. But we get not just the physical thing going on, but the spiritual one, which brings us nicely into the second cool thing about this is seeing the word prince used here within the Old Testament helps us to have a little more understanding of why does Paul use that terminology when we come into Ephesians, because that's the right terminology. That's the kind of phrasing that you would use about these things, because they are involved in leadership, unfortunately, rebellious leadership. I'll say almost always leaving room for maybe some positive spiritual beings doing their job that God assigned them to over the nations. I don't know. But those things are described as powers and authorities and rulers and all of this. They are described that way within Daniel. Paul uses that language as well in talking about them. And it's in Ephesians where Paul says, there's a seen thing happening between, Jews, Gentiles, that sort of stuff. But there's something unseen happening between all of this too, between church and world and all of that. Don't forget that that's going on. And when he finally dives into that in Ephesians 6, that's where he takes us, is there's an unseen thing too. That's not unique to Paul. That's happening in Daniel. That's happening in this discussion with Ahab. That's happening in Israel during their time in Canaan's land. It's happening in Egypt when God is leading the people of Israel out during the Exodus. So I hope, if nothing else, that lens that we get from Ephesians 6 that we're rather familiar with, the armor of God and all of this, it's really strung throughout the greater biblical narrative. Carry that with you. Like, you look for these things and go, what's the unseen thing behind the seen thing? Or are there more references to what is going on there? Because, again, as we've applied many times, it's not that guy over there or that woman over there who's saying or believing or doing these kinds of things that is my enemy. That's somebody that God wants. There is something that's pulling her or him in those kinds of directions and beliefs, and that's the thing that ultimately I'm fighting against. So Summary of all this here. From the beginning, God is at work in his people, the people of Israel, and his divine counsel to set the world right. We'll see this even more when we move into the New Testament, see what Jesus is doing, and see what the church will be doing as well when it comes to the spiritual realm. So that's all I've got. Spencer, what do you want to add as we close here?
Just one final comment to make before I close us out. When you think of this language of Prince of Persia and Prince of Greece, so these spiritual beings that are over particular geographic areas, over Persia, over Greece, it fits in with some of our previous discussion about God sending out beings to control certain areas of the world. It fits with the belief in localized gods or localized deities that we see not just reflected in Israel's belief in the Old Testament, but as we've talked about in this episode, also reflected in the beliefs of other nations. All of that fits with, as Jack mentioned, with the New Testament and Paul's discussion of the principalities, powers, and authorities. It's generally believed that Paul's language, there's the belief that the powers and the people in positions of authority in the world, sitting behind them are these spiritual powers, and they're the ones that are truly in control. So that's why Paul can say that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against the principalities, powers, and authorities in the heavenly realm, that these powers sit behind the powers and the authorities in the world. And so there's a connection between all of these themes, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more when we get into the New Testament. But that's the episode. I thank you for joining us as we continue in this series on all things related to the spiritual realm. Make sure to check out the video of this podcast and future podcasts, now that we're not just doing audio, but also doing video. You can find that on our Thinking Theologically YouTube channel. If you're watching this video or you find that channel, please, please, please subscribe to it and help us get started and grow this new video side of the podcast. You can also find the audio on any of the podcasting platforms or audio platforms that you have. You can find it on Apple Podcasts. You can find it on Spotify. You can go listen to that there. You can find all of the audio and the video, as well as additional material such as articles, on our website, thinkingtheologically.org. And you can find Thinking Theologically on any of your social media, on Facebook, on TikTok, on Instagram. I would encourage you to like or to follow us on those different platforms, again, helping us to get the word out and to get these different things that we're involved in and putting out, to get those around to people to help benefit the church moving into the future. But thank you once again for tuning in.